Daniel Harris loved the forest. He always had. For 15 years, he worked as a forest ranger in Blackwood Forest, a dense stretch of wilderness where the trees seemed to touch the sky and the fog clung to the ground like a living thing. It wasn't an easy job, but it was his job. The forest had a rhythm, a language of its own, and Daniel understood it better than anyone. But lately, something felt off. It was a cold October morning. The sun hadn't risen yet, and the sky was a dull, steel gray. Daniel pulled his old Jeep into the gravel lot near the entrance to Raven's Hollow, the most remote section of Blackwood Forest. He cut the engine, listening to the silence. He radioed in, as he always did. "Dispatch, this is Ranger Harris, starting my patrol of Raven's Hollow. Should be back by noon." "Copy that, Dan. Stay safe out there," replied a familiar voice, crackling with static. He grabbed his flashlight, adjusted his hat, and stepped out of the Jeep. The air was sharp and cold, smelling of damp earth and pine needles. He liked early mornings, when the world was still asleep, and it felt like the forest belonged to him alone. The trailhead was barely visible through the low-hanging mist. He took a deep breath and started walking, the gravel crunching beneath his boots. An hour into his patrol, Daniel noticed something odd. The birds weren't singing. Normally, the early morning was filled with their chatter, but today, the forest was silent. It wasn't just quiet, it was unnaturally still. He stopped, listening. Nothing. A chill settled in his gut. He shook it off and continued walking. He was a ranger after all. The forest had its moods. Sometimes it was quiet, sometimes it wasn't. That's just how nature worked. But a little further down the trail, he saw something that made him stop dead in his tracks. There were deep gouges in the bark of a tree. Fresh ones. 3 long slashes, jagged and raw. He knelt down, running his fingers over the grooves. The cuts were clean, deliberate. "What the hell made these?" he muttered. He pulled out his phone to take a photo, but the signal was dead. He sighed. Typical. As he stood, a sound broke the silence. A whisper. Faint. Almost too quiet to hear. He turned, his heart pounding. "Hello?" he called out. The forest didn't answer. He shined his flashlight into the trees, the beam cutting through the mist. For a moment, he thought he saw something, a pale shape just beyond the reach of the light. He blinked, and it was gone. Daniel's fingers tightened around the flashlight. His gut told him to turn back. Something was wrong here. The forest felt different, like it was holding its breath. He took a step back toward the trailhead. The whisper came again, closer this time. "Daniel." His blood ran cold. He spun around, the flashlight shaking in his grip. "Who's there?" he shouted. Silence. He reached for his radio, his hands trembling. "Dispatch, this is Ranger Harris. I think I'm turned around. Do you copy?" Static. He swallowed hard. His breath came in short gasps. He tried again. "Dispatch? Anyone?" Nothing. The cold seemed to seep into his bones. He turned, trying to find the trail, but everything looked the same. Trees and fog, stretching endlessly in every direction. He was lost, and then he saw them. Eyes staring at him from the shadows. A wave of nausea hit him. The world tilted. He staggered, his vision blurring. The last thing he heard before the darkness took him was that whisper, soft and cruel. "Daniel." When Daniel didn't return by noon, the first person to notice was his niece, Emily Carter. She called the ranger station, her voice tight with worry. "He's never late," she said. "Something's wrong." And she was right. The sun was dipping low on the horizon when Emily Carter pulled her car into the gravel lot near Raven's Hollow. The place was empty except for her uncle's old Jeep, parked crookedly near the trailhead. The sight of it made her stomach twist. Daniel Harris was never careless. She stepped out of her car, the cold air biting at her cheeks. The forest loomed before her, shrouded in shadows and mist. It seemed to breathe, alive with secrets. Emily's fingers tightened around her phone, her heart pounding with dread. She dialed the ranger station for the third time that day. "Ranger Talbot here," a gruff voice answered. "Detective Talbot, it's Emily Carter," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "I'm at the trailhead. His Jeep is still here. He hasn't come back." There was a pause. "All right," Talbot said. "I'm on my way. Stay put." She hung up and leaned against her car, trying to calm her racing thoughts. The wind rustled the leaves, carrying whispers from the trees. She turned, half expecting to see someone, or something, watching her from the shadows. But there was nothing. 20 minutes later, Detective Mark Talbot arrived in a battered police SUV. He was a tall, broad-shouldered man with a perpetually furrowed brow. His eyes, sharp and gray, scanned the area as he stepped out of the vehicle. "Emily," he said with a nod. "Detective," she replied. "His radio's dead and his phone's not getting a signal. He always checks in. Something's wrong." Talbot rubbed his chin, his expression grim. "We'll find him," he said, though his tone lacked conviction. "Let's start with the basics." They moved toward the trailhead. The forest was darker now, the mist thicker. Talbot shined a powerful flashlight along the path, its beam barely cutting through the gloom. "Let's go slow," he said. "Look for anything out of place." They walked in silence, the only sounds the crunch of leaves and the distant hoot of an owl. Emily's heart thudded in her chest, each step dragging her deeper into a growing sense of dread. Then she saw it, the tree with the gouges. She stopped cold, grabbing Talbot's arm. "Look!" Talbot leaned in, his brow furrowing. "These cuts are fresh," he muttered. "Too clean for an animal." He snapped a few photos, then turned to Emily. "Stay close." They continued deeper into the woods, following the faint trail. The temperature seemed to drop with every step, the cold seeping into Emily's bones. "Daniel!" she called out, her voice swallowed by the mist. There was no reply. They pressed on, the trees closing in around them. The flashlight's beams swept across the forest floor, and then stopped, a boot print. Talbot crouched down, examining it. "It's his," he said, "but it's heading away from the trail." "Why would he go off the path?" Emily whispered. "Let's find out." They followed the prints, which led them deeper into the wilderness. The forest grew denser, the air heavier. The sense of being watched gnawed at Emily's mind. Suddenly, Talbot froze. "Do you hear that?" he asked. Emily strained her ears. At first, she heard nothing. But then, faint and distant, came a sound that chilled her to the core. Whispering. It drifted through the trees like voices carried on the wind. Words she couldn't understand, but that filled her with an inexplicable dread. "Daniel?" she called out, her voice shaking. The whispering stopped. The silence that followed was worse. It was a silence that pressed down on them, thick and suffocating. Then, from the shadows, came a single word. "Emily." Her blood ran cold. Talbot grabbed her arm. "We're going back, now." "But what about Daniel?" she protested. "Something's wrong here," he said, his eyes darting around. "We need more people, more light." They turned back, retracing their steps. The forest felt different now, hostile, almost alive. The path twisted, the trees closing in. The whispering started again, louder this time, like a chorus of unseen voices. "Emily! Emily!" They broke into a run, the flashlight beam bobbing wildly. Emily's lungs burned, her heart pounding. When they finally burst out of the trees and into the gravel lot, Emily collapsed against her car, gasping for breath. The whispering stopped, swallowed by the night. Talbot's face was pale, his jaw clenched. "We'll come back," he said, "with a full team, at first light." Emily nodded, tears streaming down her face, but deep down, a cold certainty settled in her gut. Her uncle was still out there, and he wasn't alone. Morning came slowly, the pale sun barely piercing the thick fog that clung to Blackwood Forest. The air was cold and heavy, filled with a silence that felt unnatural. The ranger station buzzed with subdued activity as a search party prepared to enter the woods. Flashlights clicked on, maps were unfolded, and hushed conversations passed between grim faces. Emily Carter stood at the edge of the group, hugging her coat tighter around her. Her eyes were red from lack of sleep, and her mind was a blur of fear and determination. She couldn't shake the memory of the whispering voices in the woods the night before. Detective Mark Talbot joined her, adjusting the strap of his backpack. His face was drawn, his eyes shadowed. "Ready?" he asked quietly. Emily nodded. "Let's find him." Talbot turned to address the group of volunteers and officers. "We're splitting into teams of 3. Stay within radio contact and mark your trail. If you see anything unusual, report it immediately. Don't go off the path." There were murmurs of agreement, but an undercurrent of unease lingered in the air. These weren't inexperienced people, but Blackwood Forest had a reputation. And now, it felt like the forest itself was watching. Emily joined Talbot and a young ranger named Ryan. They headed into the forest, the mist swallowing them whole. The trees stood like sentinels, their branches tangled overhead, blocking out what little light there was. They walked in silence, their boots crunching over damp leaves and twigs. The beam of Talbot's flashlight cut through the mist, but the shadows seemed to shift just beyond its reach. Emily's breath came in short, nervous bursts. After an hour, Talbot paused and pointed to the ground. "Boot prints," he said. "Daniel's." Emily's heart leapt. The tracks were faint, but they were there, heading off the main trail and into the denser part of the forest. "Why would he go this way?" she whispered. Talbot's jaw tightened. "We need to find out." They followed the prints, the forest growing darker with each step. The mist thickened, wrapping around them like cold fingers. The whispering started again, so faint it was almost lost in the rustling of the trees. Emily shivered. "Do you hear that?" Talbot nodded, his face pale. "Stay close." The whispering grew louder, the words still unintelligible, but filled with urgency. Emily's skin prickled, the hair on the back of her neck standing on end. She glanced at Ryan, whose face was a mask of fear. "This isn't right," he muttered. "We should turn back." "We can't," Emily said, her voice trembling. "My uncle's out there." Talbot gripped her shoulder. "We'll find him. Just stay calm." They pushed forward, the trees closing in, the whispering now a constant, insistent presence. The path twisted and turned, leading them deeper into the unknown. Suddenly, the forest opened into a small clearing. In the center stood an old, weathered cabin. The walls were gray with age, the roof sagging under the weight of years. Vines crept up the sides, and the windows were dark and empty. The clearing was dead silent, the air thick with anticipation. Emily's heart pounded in her chest. "What is this place?" Talbot scanned the area, his flashlight trembling slightly. "I don't know, but it doesn't feel right." Ryan took a step back. "We shouldn't be here." The whispering grew louder, swirling around them like a vortex. The air turned colder, each breath forming a visible mist. Emily took a shaky step toward the cabin. "He might be inside." "Wait," Talbot said, grabbing her arm. "We go together." They approached the cabin, the wooden porch creaking under their weight. The door was ajar, a sliver of darkness visible through the gap. Emily's stomach twisted. Talbot pushed the door open, the hinges groaning in protest. Inside, the air was stale and cold. The walls were lined with shelves covered in dust and cobwebs. An old table sat in the center of the room, a broken chair beside it. Papers were scattered across the floor, yellowed with age. And in the corner, something moved. Emily's breath caught in her throat. "Uncle Daniel," she whispered. The figure turned slowly. It was Daniel Harris. But something was wrong. His eyes were wide and unseeing, his face pale and gaunt. His clothes were torn and dirty, and his hands trembled. "Daniel," Talbot said, stepping forward. Daniel's mouth moved, but his voice was a faint whisper. "Get out." His eyes flicked to Emily, and for a brief moment they filled with recognition. "Emily, you need to leave." The whispering surged, louder now, deafening. The cabin shook, the walls vibrating with unseen energy. Daniel's face contorted in pain. "It won't let me go." "What won't let you go?" Emily cried, tears streaming down her face. "The forest, it's alive. It wants—" His voice was swallowed by the whispering, now a roar. The light in the cabin flickered. Shadows twisted and writhed, reaching out from the walls. Talbot grabbed Emily's arm. "We have to go, now!" But Emily couldn't move, her eyes locked on her uncle. Daniel's face twisted with terror. "Run!" The shadows surged forward and the world went dark. The world was a blur of shadows and screams as they fled the cabin. Emily's feet pounded the forest floor, her breath ragged, heart hammering against her ribs. Talbot's grip on her arm was like a vice, dragging her through the dense trees and choking mist. The whispering followed them, a relentless chorus of voices just beyond the edge of understanding. Behind them, the cabin groaned and cracked, as if the forest itself was swallowing it whole. "Don't stop!" Talbot shouted, his voice hoarse. Ryan was ahead, crashing through the undergrowth, his flashlight bouncing wildly. Branches clawed at Emily's face and arms, but she didn't care. All that mattered was running, escaping the darkness closing in behind them. After what felt like an eternity, they burst into a small clearing. Talbot stopped, bent over, gasping for air. Emily collapsed to her knees, tears streaking her dirt-smeared cheeks. The whispering finally faded, replaced by an eerie silence. Ryan's eyes were wide with terror. "What the hell was that?" he choked out. Talbot straightened, his face pale and grim. "I don't know, but we're getting out of here." He reached for his radio and clicked the button. "This is Detective Talbot. We need immediate extraction. We're at coordinates." His voice trailed off, static. He tried again, his hands shaking. "Dispatch, do you copy?" Nothing but dead air. Emily's stomach twisted. "We can't be trapped here. We have to get back to the trailhead." Talbot nodded. "Let's keep moving. Stay close." They turned back toward the direction they'd come from, but something was wrong. The clearing was familiar, yet different. The path they had taken was gone, swallowed by the shifting trees. The forest seemed to twist around them, the fog thickening, erasing any sense of direction. "We're going in circles," Ryan whispered, panic creeping into his voice. Talbot clenched his jaw. "Stay calm. We'll find a way out." But Emily knew deep down that the forest wasn't going to let them go, not yet. As they trudged forward, a cold wind swept through the trees, carrying the faint scent of decay. The whispering returned, softer this time, like a lullaby just out of reach. Then Emily saw something ahead, a break in the trees, a narrow path winding to the right. "There!" she shouted. "That looks familiar." Without waiting, she ran ahead, the others following close behind. The path twisted and turned, the fog thinning slightly. The forest seemed to breathe around them, the trees watching with cold indifference. After a few minutes, they stumbled into another clearing, but this one wasn't empty. In the center stood an old stone monument, weathered and covered in moss. Strange symbols were carved into its surface, symbols that seemed to shift and writhe when Emily tried to focus on them. At the base of the monument lay a scattering of bones, yellowed with age. Talbot knelt beside the monument, his eyes narrowing. "What is this?" Emily's breath caught in her throat. "It's a grave, an old one." Ryan backed away, his face pale. "We shouldn't be here." But Emily felt a strange compulsion, a pull toward the monument. She stepped closer, her fingers tracing the symbols. As soon as she touched the stone, a surge of cold shot through her. The whispering grew louder, more insistent. Images flashed through her mind, the forest, ancient and wild, filled with shadows and eyes, and a figure standing at the edge of the trees, watching, waiting. A voice, deep and echoing, filled her head. "You took from us. Now we take from you." She yanked her hand back, gasping. Her vision cleared, and she stumbled away from the monument. "What did you see?" Talbot asked, his eyes searching hers. Emily's voice trembled. I think the forest is cursed. There's something here. Something old. And it's angry." Ryan's hands shook. "We need to get out of here. Now." Talbot nodded. "Agreed. But we need to figure out how." Emily looked back at the monument, dread pooling in her stomach. The symbols seemed to pulse, alive with a malevolent energy. Her uncle's words echoed in her mind. "It won't let me go." Suddenly, the whispering grew louder, the air vibrating with it. The ground trembled and the shadows deepened. The forest was waking up, and it was hungry. The ground shuddered beneath their feet as the whispering grew into a deafening roar. The forest around them seemed to ripple and blur, the trees bending inward as though the woods themselves were alive and closing in. Emily clutched Talbot's arm, her heart hammering. "We have to get out of here now." Talbot's face was pale, his eyes darting around for an escape route. Ryan backed away from the stone monument, his breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The symbols on the monument pulsed with a dark light, the air vibrating with unseen energy. Emily could feel the cold tendrils of something ancient, something hungry, reaching for them. Then a voice, deep and hollow, echoed from the monument itself. "You have trespassed. You will pay the price." The air thickened, the cold growing unbearable. Shadows spilled out from the base of the monument, pooling like ink, writhing and stretching toward them. Talbot grabbed Emily's hand. "Run!" They bolted from the clearing, crashing through the undergrowth. The forest seemed to twist and stretch, the paths they knew warping and vanishing. The mist clung to their skin, icy and suffocating. Emily's legs burned, her lungs screamed for air, but she didn't dare stop. The whispering was all around them, no longer faint, but a furious cacophony of voices. Then, from the shadows behind them, came a shriek of pure rage. Emily risked a glance back and saw the shadows rising, a writhing mass of darkness with eyes, dozens of eyes, watching, chasing. "We're not going to make it," Ryan gasped, tears streaming down his face. "Yes, we are," Talbot shouted. "Keep running!" They stumbled through a thicket of branches, emerging onto a narrow trail. Emily's heart leapt. The trailhead. The faint outline of Daniel's jeep was visible through the thinning fog. Salvation. Safety. Just a few more steps. But as they raced toward the trailhead, a wall of shadow erupted from the ground, blocking their path. The shadows formed into twisted shapes, arms, fingers, faces locked in silent screams. Emily skidded to a stop, her breath caught in her throat. "No," she whispered. The shadows closed in, tendrils snaking toward their feet. Ryan screamed as the darkness wrapped around his ankle, yanking him backward. "Ryan!" Talbot lunged for him, but the shadows swallowed the young ranger whole. His scream faded into the darkness. "Ryan!" Emily's voice broke, tears blurring her vision. Talbot grabbed her shoulder, his face stricken. "We can't save him! We have to go!" The shadows advanced, the air vibrating with dark energy. Then, from deep within the forest, came a voice Emily recognized. "Emily!" She turned, her heart clenching. Her uncle stood at the edge of the trail, his face pale and hollow, his eyes filled with a desperate light. "Uncle Daniel!" she cried. He held out his hand. "Trust me!" Without thinking, she grabbed Talbot's arm and sprinted toward her uncle. The shadows writhed and screamed behind them, the forest trembling with fury. Daniel pulled them through a narrow gap between the trees, the darkness snapping at their heels. They ran blindly, the forest a blur of branches and fog. The whispering voices faded, replaced by the pounding of their hearts. Suddenly, they burst into the gravel lot. The jeep, the cars, the ranger station's lights in the distance. They were out. Emily collapsed to the ground, gasping for air. Talbot bent over, hands on his knees, his face drenched in sweat. Daniel stood over them, his eyes hollow, his body trembling. "You made it," he whispered. Emily looked up, tears streaming down her face. "Uncle Daniel, what happened? What is this place?" Daniel's eyes filled with pain. "The forest is old, Emily. Older than any of us. There's something here, something that doesn't want to be disturbed. I got too close, and it wouldn't let me go." Talbot straightened, his jaw tight. "We need to get out of here, now." Daniel nodded. "It won't follow us beyond the edge of the forest, but we can never come back." They stumbled to their feet and made their way to the cars. The forest loomed behind them, dark and silent, the mist swirling like a living thing. As they climbed into the vehicles, Emily looked back one last time. The trees stood like sentinels, the shadows deep beneath their branches. The whispering was gone, but she could still feel the presence watching them, waiting. The forest had let them go. But she knew, deep in her bones, that it was only because it had decided to let them live. For now. As they drove away, the first rays of sunlight broke through the mist, casting long shadows over Blackwood Forest. But the darkness remained, hidden among the trees, a secret as old as time. And some secrets are better left undisturbed.